Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on the call. We have about half the attendees who have registered now, so I'll give them another minute or so to join, and then we'll go forward because I certainly want to be respectful of everyone's time on this webinar. While we're waiting for those additional people, for those of you who are on the call already or on the webinar already, you should be able to see a chat pod on my screen. It's in the right-hand side of the screen towards the bottom. And there, we'll talk about this in a moment. That is the place if you have questions or comments and you want to communicate to me, certainly, and I believe everyone else on the webinar will see it. I'm not certain about that, but I believe that to be the case. That's where you can go ahead and put that information. So we'll give them another minute or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And incidentally, if somebody could just send me a chat message and just let me know that you can see the presentation, you can hear me and see me, that'd be helpful, please. And I'm just double checking if everyone's able to hear me at this point. I'm not seeing any feedback, so I'm not certain if that's working or not. Okay. Oh, good. Thank you very much, Jess. I was just going to make a change to see if things were not working properly, but again, I'll go ahead and get started because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you very much for attending. This is actually the second webinar that we've done with M4 Global Consulting LLC. Last month, we did a presentation or a webinar on updates to the chemical regulations in the Middle East, some very interesting things that are coming down the pike. And one of the things that we talked about in that webinar in much less detail, of course, was Israel's draft chemicals regulation. That webinar was intended to give people an overview. This is going to get much more into the details of the industrial chemicals regulation, or the ICR. So for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet before, and it looks like about a 50-50 mix of people I know on the webinar, people that have not had a chance to meet before. M4 Global Consulting was founded about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, in 2009. My background is I've worked over 25 years in chemical and consumer product regulatory positions in many of the major global regulatory firms. So AkzoNobel, Kimberly-Clark, Koch Industries, Procter & Gamble, absolutely been able to do that. And I've had manager and director roles in those positions. Nathaniel, I'm going to talk about this in a second, but yes, you're right. You'll actually get the PowerPoint slides and the recording of the webinar as well. Additionally, I've published over about a dozen professional journal articles on a variety of topics and 2 chemical regulatory handbooks, interestingly, one of which came out in 2018 from John Wiley and Sons on chemical regulation in the Middle East. And I've also had the opportunity to speak globally on both Latin America and Middle Eastern chemical regulations. So just one quick slide for those of you who don't know anything about the firm itself. As I talked about, I've got over 25 years of experience, so I have that hands-on regulatory expertise, but also the management expertise as well, working with R&D, working with marketing, working with sales and finance, especially product supply, purchasing, all those different groups to understand how regulatory compliance comes together in a lot of these major firms. And that's that deep cross-functional experience I talked about. Those of you who aren't necessarily sure about what we do a lot of different things. We do EPA biocides. Right now, that's a big issue with disinfecting wipes and hand sanitizers. For those of you that are here because of the Middle East, for example, and also if you've had some webinars in the past on Latin America, here are some of the opportunities that we've brought to fruition in those areas. So everything from disinfectant for COVID in Mexico, hard surface quats in various countries in the Middle East, and food contact surface cleaners in certain areas of the Middle East as well, especially those in Algeria and Tunisia, which many people may not be aware have chemical regulations in place. And I don't say that to be negative. It's just people may not operate in those spaces and know they have regulations in place, as well as for something as specific as food contact surface cleaners. So again, the agenda, we're going to go over the background very quickly because I realize a lot of people on this call may not have information about Israel in general, how they currently work, how they currently manage chemical substances, and we'll talk a little bit about biocides and worker safety, but mainly chemical substances, to give you an understanding of where they are right now. Then we're going to talk about the Industrial Chemicals Registration Law, which is this particular law in place that's coming into effect in a couple of years, this ICR. And then, of course, we'll have questions. And as you'll see here, one of the things that I will do is I will take questions in the chat room as we go forward, because sometimes that's easier for people if you may not remember the question at the end when we do the Q&A. So I can't promise I'll get to it in real time in the chat room, but certainly put it in there and we'll see what we can do. Mute your microphone if you haven't done that already. The format of this presentation is not intended to be exhaustive. And by that, I mean, I'm not trying to cover every different aspect, for example, of how you would import, how you would notify, how you would store chemicals under the ICR. This is just to give you an overview of all the aspects of the regulation at a broad view, and then also give you enough information to where you can take the slides and the recording afterwards and go back and look at the regulation yourself and get more detail and spend more time. So I will, again, give you the overview and the references. And as we said, again, I mentioned to Nathaniel, the recording and the slides will be sent to you shortly after this presentation. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and also as a refresher for those of you who are, starting in 1993, the Ministry of Environmental Protection has been the main authority in Israel that deals with what they call hazardous substances and, of course, hazardous substance regulations. And you see here, this management by what we're going to call the ministry as a shorthand includes classification of substances, toxicity, risk assessment, and then all the things we're familiar with in other countries of the world. So the manufacture, import, export, packaging, storage, shipping, everything that goes along with that has historically been handled by the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Interestingly, in Israel, at the local level, they have over three dozen municipal environmental units, quote unquote, and associations of towns for environmental quality that operate. So this is something we see a lot, well, in a lot of different jurisdictions, certainly, but a lot throughout the Middle East. You'll have these overarching national regulations. And then in certain cases, you'll have these local, these provincial or these regional type of aspects that exist as well, who may have different or even additional regulatory requirements for chemical substances that the country as a whole does not. One place we really see that quite often is in Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia itself does not have a national inventory of chemical substances, but two specific cities and regions of Saudi Arabia do have a positive list where you must make a notification of chemical substances in Saudi Arabia. So I always caution people when I do in-person training and web training, don't just think because the federal legislation or the national legislation says something does not need to happen. Always remember to look at the local regulations as well. And you see here, ultimately, those 36 municipal environmental units and the associations roll up to the Ministry of Environmental Protection. So they are not a national, again, across the board throughout Israel authority, but they do ultimately administratively report up to the MEP or to the ministry. One of the interesting things, or many interesting things about Israel, but one of them is that over time, these government agencies that you see here have really expanded their role and their authority when it comes to chemical substance regulation. And you see here 5 of them in particular. And I put these for 2 different reasons. The first one is because people say, when I'm going to notify a substance in Israel, either in the past or going forward in the future under this new regulation, who do I need to speak with? And I say, well, there are multiple ministries depending on what you're trying to do, what your substance is, what your intended use is. So you see the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Labor is there, Ministry of Agriculture, if you're talking about pesticides or agricultural pesticides. The Chemical and Environment Administration is a specific subset of the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Labor. So as I said before, just because something is at the federal level doesn't mean there are localized levels. So here you have to go to the MITL, but then you also have to go, depending on your substance and your uses, to a specific subset, a specific organization in the MITL, which is the Chemical and Environment Administration. Again, Ministry of Agriculture, which is different from the Ministry of Agricultural and Rural Development. I just realized I have agriculture on there twice. I need to make that change. And the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance is one that people don't always think they might have to go before. But one of the areas that the Ministry of Finance gets involved is when you're talking about your net contents or your net weight of your product that is put on your product label. Ministry of Finance has authority to ensure that those are correct and to assess violations if they are found to be underfilled, let's say. So Ministry of Finance is not something people normally think about, but that is certainly one of the aspects to be aware of. Generally speaking, Israel has this very robust chemical regulatory structure that we're familiar with in a lot of the Western countries. And you see some examples here. When they talk about safety at work regulations, those are workplace safety regulations, HAZCOM, hazard communication regulations. Israel has historically placed a really big focus on these types of safety at work regulations. You see they put standard out for a variety of chemical compounds, arsenic, lead, and others that you would see in other regulations as well. They also have a big focus on risk regulation. Historically, it hasn't been risk reduction policy. It has been risk regulation. You can do this or you can't do that, versus, well, you can do this with some process changes, for example, that will reduce the risk that's placed there. So again, a little bit different than we're used to in the past. You see some areas here where, again, we're talking historically for the regulation that we're going to talk about today. Historically, registration and licensing of chemicals is on those four groups. And you'll see when we talk about the ICRL, the regulation, it will say, unless exempted or regulated by another standard. So pesticides are not regulated under the industrial chemicals regulation, nor pharmaceuticals or cosmetics and so on. And then the question prior to this introduction that I always used to get is there a licensing framework or a national inventory for Israel, for new substances in Israel? And before this regulation came out, the answer is no. And it technically still is no, because there's a phase-in period for the new regulation. Nor is there currently a new chemical notification scheme. So if you're in Israel now, or you're looking to go into Israel now, you don't have to apply for a license for industrial chemicals, and nor do you have to make chemical notification in order to bring those products in. Now, I say that to say this. Again, going back, if there's no federal regulation, be aware of local regulations, and something we're going to talk about here in a moment. Israel, like other regulations or other regulatory bodies, has sometimes said, well, we feel this substance or this compound poses a unique hazard. So while I say there's no licensing requirement for industrial chemicals, there are hazardous substances and hazardous materials that we'll see in a moment. And Israel regulates those specific compounds. So don't just say, well, there's no framework, I don't have to comply at all, there's nothing to worry about. That may not be the case when I talk about hazardous substances and hazardous materials. So again, giving some more background, generally substance regulation in Israel has fallen under two main laws: the licensing of business law, and the main one, which really has a tendency in everything historically, is the Hazardous Substances Law, abbreviated HSL, and you'll see that throughout the presentation. And again, that's the main legislation historically that has related to what they call dangerous or hazardous chemicals. It's been around again since '93, but you see there have been several amendments that have gone through. So the HSL it looks today is not how it looked in the formation in 1993. And as I said a moment ago on the presentation, this is the regulation, this HSL, this regulation gives the ministry the authority to manage substances that it decides are hazardous. So again, no federal licensing for industrial chemicals use and import, but under the HSL, the Ministry of Environment, has the authority to say, well, we decide this particular substance is hazardous, so we can require a license, we can require pre-notification, we can require even a pre-market discussion before the substance comes into Israel. So again, beware of those somewhat small nuances, but very important nuances. And then just seeing here some of the other regulations as well. These are not part of the HSL, but these are complementary, ones that work alongside of it. So safety at work law, we talked about before with worker protection and workplace standards. Hazardous substances regulation. Again, we said, the authority has the ability to call substances hazardous, and to regulate them. This is one place they get that authority. Israeli standard number 5 from 2004 is similar to the EU CLP regulation, classification, packaging, and labeling regulation. It's not identical, so don't assume that one for one is the case. And we're going to talk very briefly towards the end about that. Israel does now have a GHS regulation in place for a reason we'll discuss later. There is a phase-in period for the GHS, so you don't have to have GHS labels and signage right now in Israel, but it is coming fairly soon. And then one of the ways, we've talked about this briefly, one of the ways, or the main way that chemical substances are managed in Israel is through either licensing the business who uses that chemical substance, and through what are called permits, specifically hazardous material permits. Since there aren't formal registrations, generally speaking, they will license the business who's handling the material, or they may give you a permit to handle, for example, 10 tons of material in a calendar year. So those of you working in Israel right now or looking to go in before the regulation comes into place, you want to look at Annex 1 of the HSL. And the HSL lists what the authority, the ministry, has given as 29, quote unquote, harmful substances and mixtures. So again, no notification formally, but you still may be subject to the HSL under Annex 1. Look there, look at one of those 29 components that are listed as harmful substances and mixtures apply to you. If so, you may have reporting or notification obligations. Annex 2 of the same legislation, 19, what are called toxic chemicals. Annex 1 is harmful substances, and Annex 2 is your toxic chemicals. So make sure you look at both particular annexes when you're looking at chemical regulation in Israel. And you see here both of those regulate users. So the user could be the end user, the user could be the manufacturer, the distributor, the transporter, however your business is set up. It could be more than just the person actually producing the chemical. And you see here, of course, they have very specific regulations that need to be followed, or categories that need to be followed regarding production and import and so on. So HSL defines hazardous materials as each of the substances specified in Schedule 2. Now, again, we're going to break this apart here. Schedule 2, not Annex 2. So we looked at Annex 1, which is your harmful substances, Annex 2, which is your toxic chemicals, but then there's a hazardous material list in Schedule 2. That's different. That's in the actual regulation. That's not in the annexes. It's not Annex 2. Please don't, I know they sound similar, at least when you're first looking at it, but they are two completely different aspects. So each of the substances specified, whether in its simple form or mixed with or blended with other substances. So you don't have an exemption, generally speaking, if it's the neat chemistry versus if it's mixed or blended with other substances. Sometimes, you work with different national regulations, and if you mix things together and you have a site-limited intermediate where you don't intend it to go off-site and things like that, you could have an exemption. Excuse me. In this case, under the HSL, you don't have that. Talking again about permits, only under the HSL, only people who have a hazardous material permit can handle such chemicals. We've talked about that. And the permit, this is especially crucial, the permit is only valid for a special time and with special criteria. So when you get a permit from the authority, if it's required, it's going to be for a certain amount of months or years, whatever it might be. And it's going to be very specific to the type of enterprise. So it's for manufacturing at this particular facility located here in Israel. The type of material, again, will be specific to the license, and the quantity. So again, you're going to be quantity limited. You can't necessarily bring in or manufacture an unlimited amount. You actually have to be governed by your particular permit. And then we've touched on this briefly, and I don't spend too much time on it because it's really not an afterthought, but not as important as the HSL. Every place that sells these hazardous substances has to obtain a license under the licensing of business laws. So again, going back to the beginning where we said, make sure you know which ministries and who to talk to, you may say, well, I've got my permit under the HSL, therefore I'm good to go. but you also need a separate license for your business because you're going to, if you are selling hazardous substances. So again, make sure you're aware of all the requirements that you have going forward. So now we got the background in place, so you kind of know where we're coming from when we talk about the Industrial Chemicals Registration Law. The question that came to my mind first when I was reading the regulation is, why is Israel doing this now? They seem to have some regulations in place that we've looked at. They seem to function fairly well. People are aware of them. They're issuing permits. They have lists of substances. Why are they doing the ICRL now? Well, the first one is, you see from the preamble to the regulation itself, regarding the situation in Israel, this is the authority who put the regulation together, saying it's not known what industrial chemicals are in the country and what their uses are. They're essentially or effectively admitting they don't really have a grasp, the authority doesn't, the ministry doesn't, of the chemicals that in the regulation. Mark, I just saw your thing. I apologize. That's the first I'm hearing about it. So hopefully it'll come through in the recording that the audio is not the best it could be. And there's no clear picture of the existing regulations. So the ministry doesn't think that there's a particular list of regulations that apply to each chemical. They say, we're not really sure what's out there and we don't know how much is out there. And even when we know things that are out there, we don't know what regulations apply. Second reason is, again, in the preamble, there's no overall picture of chemicals produced and imported to Israel. So we don't know what chemicals are in the country, the ministry is saying, but they're also saying we don't know overall what is imported into Israel. You may have customs declarations and things like that, but you don't necessarily have, according to the authority, to the ministry, a picture of what is imported. We talked about production earlier on, but they're talking about it here as well. So they don't have a sense really of what is going on in the country by their own admission. And that's, again, not to be negative to the authority. They've recognized an issue and they are working towards remedying it. The third one, I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but Israel is a member of the OECD. And back in 2018, the OECD revised its, what I call in the shorthand here, the decision recommendation. You can see the full name as well. And what the decision recommendation was changed to back in 2018 is it required that all of the OECD member countries, and there are 36, of which Israel is one, they had to implement GHS and in a certain time frame. And for a lot of those countries, that was a non-issue. They're OECD member countries. They've had GHS in place for quite some time, not really an issue. But for two specifically, and again, I talk about how my firm deals in Latin America and also the Middle East, Israel and Peru were two who had not implemented GHS, but were OECD member countries. And as part of this industrial chemical regulation law, Israel decided, okay, we're going to do a couple things. First thing is we're going to implement GHS because it's now required, and we'll talk about that briefly. There is a regulation in place or coming into force in Israel for GHS. And then they said, well, while we're at it and we're having to classify products according to GHS and have the regulation in place, let's tackle this larger picture of the industrial chemicals regulation in the country. So for those of you, I've touched on a little bit, those of you who are wondering about some time frames, and actually I noticed, Mark, your comment, and I commented on it a moment ago, but there is a recording and the slides will also be sent out afterwards. So hopefully we'll be able to get the gist of the conversation if the audio is not quite up to par. The ICRL is proposed to enter into force in a little less than 2 years, so January 3rd, 2023. Now that's to enter into place. Then you look at it, you see the line underneath it, which might be a little counterintuitive. It says the national inventory is expected to be established about 18 months later, September 1st, 2014. So logically, you could be saying, well, how can the regulation go into place that's going to talk about registration and notification of chemicals if there isn't a national inventory? And you see that in the third bullet point, what the authority, the ministry has decided is in those 18, 20 months, that's going to be your registration and your notification period. So based on the notifications and the registrations made in that 20-month period between January 3rd, 2023 and September 1st, 2024, that's going to form the basis of the chemical industry. Similar to, if you know anything about the U.S. Toxic Substances Control Act, when that came out in '76, I believe, TSCA, one of the ways they did it was they said, what's in commerce at the present? And that wasn't necessarily the TSCA inventory, but they took into account what was in commerce already in comprising that national inventory. So that's where that's going to go and come from. And then also one of the questions I was particularly interested in, as I was reading the ICRL, I was pleased to see there are very strong and very specific CBI, confidential business information provisions. So they are explicitly called out, and we'll spend some time on those specifically going forward in the regulation. What is considered CBI? How do you market a CBI? And what are the requirements that the ministry has to do with information that you give CBI or that you mark as CBI? So I thought that was a very positive aspect as well. Now we're going to spend some time going into the actual regulation itself. And as I said, for those of you that weren't on at the inception, this is intended to be an overview, a fairly thorough overview, but we're not going to go into every possible permutation of what kind of notification do I have to make, what are the storage limits, things like that, because that would be outside the scope and would take much longer than an hour. So I'm going to highlight the sections and key aspects in those sections that you look at later on, either in the regulation or in this presentation. So starting with Chapter A, the purpose and definitions, some of the key definitions. This is not exhaustive, but some of the key definitions. You see when you talk about the committee, you see who that is. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to Section 23. They talk about the Hazardous Materials Law. We saw that in the beginning, so they're referring to the same regulation that's already in place. What they're calling in the regulation the decisive day. That's their term for the day of September 1st, 2024 that we saw when the inventory will be issued, that they're calling that their decisive day. That's their starting day. That's their publication day. That's when everything gets formally issued. Chemical, I put this there because it's similar to most other definitions of chemical, but I highlight things in red as we go forward to catch your attention. And chemical is interested because it specifically calls out chemical elements. So to make maybe a silly example to illustrate the point, lead could be something that is restricted or likely will be restricted under the regulation. Mercury could be or will be restricted. So you have these chemical elements, not just compounds. We don't always see elements in registration laws in other countries. And again, natural, artificial, and it doesn't matter how it's used, if it's a mixture, if it's a raw material, it doesn't matter. Chemical definition is very, very broad. And new chemical, just for those of you who are, what does this mean? It's one where a report has not been submitted. So again, you're in that 20-month notification period and you haven't submitted something. At the end of that 20-month period, if there's no report submitted, that is considered to be a new chemical. So you can notify, and if you don't notify, no one notifies a particular chemical substance, after September 1st, 2024, that becomes a new chemical. So obviously there is an incentive to notify before that period. Again, looking at some definitions, chemical substance to registration. We talked about briefly how other aspects play into this. So chemicals that are subject to registration except each of the following. The first one we talked about, we looked at cosmetics and pesticides and so on. Materials supervised in accordance with the provisions of another law. So if you're regulated as a pesticide component or under the pesticide regulation in Israel, which incidentally we're not going to talk about, but they do have a pesticide regulation, a fairly strong one. You are not subject to the ICRL, but you would be subject to that regulation. A substance from which the risk level is known and insignificant. And I highlight that because that's something you will have to show to the authority in that 20-month period as they're preparing the inventory to show that A, you know the risk level, and B, you have made the determination, you, the company, that it is, as in their words, insignificant. They're not going to do the work for you. You have to advocate for your substance. Material from a natural source. I don't go into that too much, but you can look at Part C of the schedule, and that will tell you more about natural sources. And one of the questions we always get, because we see it in many, many other national inventories, polymers are exempted other than free monomers having that 2% composition or more of the mixture. That's similar to TSCA, that's similar to other EU regulations, REACH, and so on that we've seen. So the polymer definition is very similar to what we're used to. That particularly does not change or change very much. Talking about production, how do I know if I'm producing a chemical? They take the first part of their definition straight from REACH. So how REACH defines production is incorporated into the ICRL. And the second part is based on U.S. state chemical regulation. Actually, I should say United States chemical regulation. I apologize. Under TSCA, were substances that are not intended to be products. So as part of your manufacturing process, you have something that is not intended to be a finished product or a finished good are not required to be reported. They've adopted that as well. So they've taken part of REACH, they've taken part of the US TSCA regulation, combined the two, and put it in their definition of production. Then section 2, they also talk about what they call an other dealer. So you've got the dealer, who is somebody who is involved in the production, the manufacture, and so on of your substance. They use other dealer, quote unquote, as you see here. Anyone who engages in a particular chemical is the phrase they use, but that is not required to be registered. So if for some reason you are dealing with this chemical, you're engaging with the chemical that's not required to be registered, whether you're a manufacturer or an importer, they call you an other dealer. So you're exempt from notification as you're an other dealer. You don't require registration, but you still have aspects and obligations under section 2 that we can look at here in a little bit. So don't think again, well, I'm not the actual dealer myself, I'm an other dealer, I don't have any issues. You very well may. And another example of that is if you're manufacturing or importing a substance below the threshold where you're required to register, you can still be, in their terms, an other dealer, even though you don't have a registration obligation, because in this example, your volume is too low. Chemical we talked about is a little, again, but just to reiterate, that's based on the substance definition under REACH. We talked about this in the beginning. The focus of the ICRL is only on industrial chemicals. And there's a couple reasons the ministry came up with that particular focus when they were doing this. And they said, well, first of all, most of Israeli industry doesn't produce what they call original materials. They say a lot of the chemicals that they do know to be in place in Israel are, generally speaking, imported. Of course, there is manufacture, but generally speaking, they say the large amount is imported into Israel. So they said, well, there's really not a lot of original material production of chemical substances in Israel. And then they talked with the stakeholders as part of the consultation for this. And the stakeholders have said, you know, even if we have these substances and we have to register them, they're going to have this significant restriction on trade, because there are going to be so many chemicals that we're going to have to register if we take a scope larger than just industrial chemicals. It's going to really curtail the amount we can sell, and also going to constrain trade in Israel. So that was a comment that was made. And also it was believed that in cases, if they went beyond industrial chemicals, the Israeli companies that were importing chemicals were going to have a very difficult time getting information about those particular substances. They're saying, well, under the ICRL as it now exists or will exist, industrial chemicals, of course, we need information. We need tox, we need so on and so forth. That's a given. But if you expand it to non-industrial chemicals, we're going to have difficulty getting that information as it stands. The companies are not going to want to give us to them because they don't have a registration obligation. So they're trying to strike a balance between the two, and it was challenging. And the way the ministry came up with it to manage it was through the ICRL in this section 2. And we talked about, again, it applies to chemicals contained in mixtures, raw materials, but not to mixtures of chemicals in finished products. So when you have a finished good, you don't have to worry about registering that finished good, again, generally speaking, because we'll see some exemptions, under the ICRL. You have chemicals in the mixtures, the chemicals you may have to register if you're a manufacturer or importer, your industrial raw materials, but does not apply to mixtures in a finished good that's going out the door. So think of it as the components may need to be registered, but the finished good, once it goes out the door, generally speaking, does not need to be registered. One of the questions that I've gotten when I've had companies call and want to do business in Israel under this ICRL, they say, well, can we get involved in a consortia similar to REACH, similar to Turkey with the KKDIK, and come together and kind of share some of the notification costs? The Israeli authority, the ministry, specifically decided in the regulation that they will not allow the formation of consortia, because they say the market is, in their opinion, the market is relatively small, and the amount of information you would have to get from all these different countries to get together to agree on a lead registrant to make the submission, they felt that that would just be too big of a burden given the size of Israel and the size of the manufacturing and chemical industry in Israel. So they said specifically in the regulation, it's not an option to you can have a consortia or not have a consortia. They say specifically it is not allowed by the ICRL. Registration threshold right now, as the regulation is written, this is one, of course, everybody wants to know, is at 10 tons per year. But you see Article 52, as we get further into the regulation, the minister has the authority to regulate chemicals more stringently and to lower that to 1 ton per year. So don't think that, okay, I'm at 9.9 tons per year and nothing will ever change to where I have to register. Article 52 allows the minister to lower that to 1 ton per year if they feel it is warranted. And again, some of those we're looking at before, some exemptions, where they're regulated under another law, we talked about insignificant risk level. These are the actual subsections, Part A, B, and C, and then for polymers, where you find that specific information. So a few minutes ago, we talked generally about how things were regulated and there were exemptions. Here's where you can go into the registration and actually see them and read more about them. Talking about manufacturer and importer liability. The manufacturer importer cannot hold or market a substance unless he is aware of the properties that may result from it. So saying, I don't know, I imported this, the manufacturer or importer wouldn't, or the manufacturer, I should say, wouldn't tell me about it, specifically is not a defense under the ICRL. They need to know many things, and you need to know, as you see here, including the details of the information that's set out in one of the schedules. So you can't just say, I don't know, they sent it to me, I asked them for information about the risks, they said, we're not going to tell you, I tried. That's not sufficient under the regulation. And then a manufacturer importer, here's where you get into that, has to provide the purchaser with information about the chemical and the risk. So here's where it's positively in the regulation. And it also needs to provide them with a safety data sheet. The regulation says, the ICRL says, safety data sheet prepared in accordance with the Hazardous Substances Act. That has been replaced or is in the process of being replaced by the GHS standard. Because remember, we talked about how that needs to be formatted because they're now an OCD member. So they published the GHS standard in May of 2019, and they gave you a little over a 3-year transition period on GHS until the 9th of August of next year. So the regulation says Hazardous Substances Act for the safety data sheet, but it's actually going to be replaced by the time this comes in by the GHS regulation. Duty to report, again, talking about information you have to give to the authority. You must be registered before the determining day, and that's where we said the determining day is the day, September 1st, 2024, that the inventory gets issued. For new chemicals, you have to give the notification, and again, the new chemicals are those that have not been notified by September of 2024. For new chemical, you have to make a notification at least 30 days before you produce or import if you exceed registration threshold. And remember, again, it could be 10 tons per year, that could be 1 ton per year. It may change depending on your substance. You have to give the authority at least a 30-day notice before you manufacture or import in excess of that volume. And then one of the interesting things, we're seeing a lot more, of course, now, under certain sections of the ICRL, that submission must take place online. You don't have the option for paper documentation or a conversation with the authority or an email. You have to submit the information online, and you will get confirmation or potentially denial of that registration attempt by the same manner, by the online process. Talking quickly, some other obligations. You must hold the data that you submit for 5 years from the date of submission. They will do spot audits, so that's your time frame you need to retain the data for. And every 4 years, you're required in Israel under the ICRL to provide the registrar with updated information about a chemical that requires registration in a format that they'll give you. So in the United States, every 4 years, we have an update obligation for chemicals. It's very similar to that. The content may differ, but the concept of the reporting, at least under TSCA and so on, is very similar to what they're doing in Israel. I'm sorry. Maintenance of the chemicals registry. So the registrar will, of course, have a register of chemicals that are subject to the regulation. That's what they're talking about in September of 2024. It'll include the information, and interestingly, may include information from other sources. So it may be in addition to what you submit. They may decide to include in the registry for your substance information that's on other databases in Israel. So for example, if it's got a dual use and it could be used, let's say, as a pesticide as well, if you've made a notification to the pesticide authority, that information could be included. The ministry has the authority and the ability to include that additional information in the registry relating to your substance and other authorities. So it can pull on TSCA, it can pull on REACH, it can pull on KKDIK in Turkey or K-REACH in South Korea. It has that ability. It's not saying it will, but it's saying should they decide that they want to, maybe for lack of information or sufficient information, they have the ability to do that. So just something to be aware of depending on your substance. The register is going to be made online free of charge, and they'll publish it. We talked in the very beginning. Remember, I said one of the very interesting things that I'm happy to see is that CBI, confidential business information, is specifically protected in the ICRL. And you see here, the registrar shall not publish certain information. If you've marked it as confidential and requested they not publish it, you can go in and figure out in the regulation and see how to do that in their particular format. And for this purpose, they define protected information, quote unquote, as information that constitutes a trade secret or is information that may not be disclosed under any law. So trade secret is probably fairly obvious. Information that may not be disclosed under any law could be if it has national security implications or military implications for Israel. You have a chemical that's used in a certain type of firearm or weapon or explosive or whatever it is. They must not disclose that under Israeli law. So therefore, under the ICRL, it will not be disclosed either. The registrar does have an out, so to speak, though. They say that they are entitled to publish this protected information, but they will give you the opportunity to see if you want to challenge that or challenge that publication effectively. So if they say we want to publish it, they have to go back to the manufacturer or importer first, say this is what we think, because we think there's a public health issue or benefit or public safety or environment issue or benefit. We want to publish this CBI, this confidential business information. They give you the opportunity to make your case to oppose that. Then what they, as you see on in the red down here, what they will rule on, does your protection of CBI outweigh the expected harm to the claimant, the person asking it to be released, if it's held confidential. They do basically a risk balance. We talked about in the beginning, historically, they haven't done that. They're going to do this here specifically in the ICRL. Okay, so under Chapter B of the regulation, these 9 items are not, and that's the emphasis is mine, it's not bolded in the regulation. I just put it there to call to your attention. These 9 items are not considered to be unpublished information. So if you have these things, they are not to be considered unpublished information. So your trade name can't be claimed CBI. Your popular name, your chemical name cannot be considered to be protected, or you cannot claim it to be protective. Classification and labeling, that's going to come under GHS, the Israeli GHS regulation. That has to be public. You can argue that's going to be on your product label anyway or in your safety data sheet, so it wouldn't make sense to keep it under confidential under the ICRL. And then a lot of things that you would normally expect, you would see on a safety data sheet, for example, about how to dispose of a chemical, you know, PPE, personal protective equipment, toxicology and ecotoxicology information. No. There specifically, it talks about the summary of the findings cannot be considered something. Well, I didn't get any information, therefore I can't go ahead and contribute anything. Talked about safety data sheets before. And we talked about the standard that's very similar to the EU CLP regulation. These things we've talked about previously, but here, as I'm telling you, they exist in Section 3 to where you can go and read about them specifically. Section 4 talks about the manufacturers and importers. They have to have the minimum information that they have to require to report to the authority. They're not required to report detailed information similar to how you might find under EU REACH at the registration stage. They can come back later and require that from you. And they're only required to report information which is, to use their language, reasonably expected to be in your possession. And this, I'm sure, is going to be a very interesting point of contention, where if you don't have information, you say, well, I can't reasonably be expected to have BOD data for that product for some reason. Or, I can't expect to have sensitization information because of the physical form of the product, how it's used. There'll be a lot of challenges, I think, to where what is called reasonable and what is not called reasonable. Again, we've talked about them before, but you're actually seeing here in the regulation, Section 4 is where it talks about that 30-day notice prior to manufacture or import. Section 4B does give the registrar the ability to amend the reporting requirements and an extension of time. So if for some reason you feel you can't do it in 30 days, certainly contact the ministry and give them a rational explanation for that. And they have the authority under the regulation to extend that time, or in some cases, even amend the data that's required, at least in terms of the regulation. Continuing in Section 4, importing of new chemicals, you have to have a certificate if you're citing data regarding your right to the information. Those of you that are familiar with the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act in the United States, FIFRA, one of the ways that you can give information to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to support a registration is you can, what they call, cite to someone's data. You can say, well, there's this product in the market. I've either paid for their data or the data is in the public literature. I'm not going to recreate it. I'm going to cite to it. I'm going to tell you, EPA, go look at the regulation, go look at the data, and say that I'm going to use that in my notification, my submission. Here, they're saying if you're going to do that, you have to get a certificate that tells the authority you have the permission to do that. You can't just tell them it was granted to me. You can't give them a letter from the other party. It has to be an actual certificate. Lab tests, generally speaking, are not required as part of your basic submission, but as we said a moment ago, the ministry has the ability to require other things, and that's one of the other things that they can require. Additional information, we talked about 5 years, and we talked about updating 4 years. Here you see the specific sections where you can go and find out more information about those general topics. Key aspect, the ministry is going to appoint a registrar who will manage that registry. So it's not going to be the ministry as a whole. They're going to have a separate subdivision, let's say, or division within the Ministry of Environment with a registrar who's going to be responsible for managing these substances. And again, talking again in Section 8, this is where you can find that other information or other information from different countries that could be included as well. Here's the nuts and bolts of that language is. Section 9, again, we talked about earlier, but here's where it's actually codified, publicly available, publicly searchable at no cost. There is not, as of now, in the regulation, a provision for a public inventory and a private inventory like we've seen sometimes in the past with TSCA, the confidential inventory under TSCA in the United States. As of now, the way the regulation is written, you're only going to have a publicly available free registry minus the information that you claim successfully as CBI, as confidential business information. So everything will be there except your CBI information. So they will be able to see, for example, the common name or the trade name of your substance, as we saw a moment ago, on the inventory. Maybe not the specific data relating to that, but they'll be able to see that. And that's not something you can protect as CBI. Again, for example, if you had a separate inventory, a confidential inventory, there's one inventory that's in place. One of the interesting things we didn't talk about here, you see Section 9B, and again, this is draft regulation. So it proposes that the registrar have the ability to always default to publication of information. Generally saying if there's any question in the registrar's mind about whether information that either should be published or has been claimed as CBI should be published, they're going to defer to publishing it. Again, you'll still have that period where they'll go back to you and say, make a claim to substantiate why this should not be. But the default position is going to be always publish, and publish as much as actually possible versus keeping things protected. And then again, 9B is where you're going to get into the information we talked about, things that are not considered protected information. We did a summary of it. Here it is actually in the regulation. Going forward, now we're going to start merging sections together, because as you get further into the regulation, it's not as nuanced, it is more nuanced, I should say. So I'm going to give you general overviews. Section 10 talks about how they're going to prioritize these substances that are in that list as of September 1st, 2024. The ministry has assumed or made the calculated decision that there's going to be more than 20,000 substances registered or notified or pre-notified before the inventory comes out. So that's, again, that's their reasonable estimate or the reasonable decision. It may be more than that, it may be less than that, but that's what they're basing their work on going forward. And you see some of the methodology that they plan to use. Risk properties, we talked about how much is in Israel. Theoretically, substances that are less present will be regulated less. I don't know that, but that would be my assumption. How many uses, and then types of exposure to the public and to the environment. They're also going to look at some other things for prioritization, which will govern that. And are there any regulations in place that govern the chemical? So again, we said, for example, your substance may not be subject to the ICRL because it's used in a pesticide application and it's regulated under the pesticide regulation standard. But Israel may say, well, you know what? It is regulated under another regulation, another legislation, another statute. So we decide for our own reasons, we're going to possibly prioritize that and bring that into the ICRL. So again, going back to what we said in the beginning, don't just say, well, I am covered under another regulation, therefore I don't have an obligation here. The authority has the aspect under Section 10 to include you if they so choose, even though you're technically exempt the way the regulation is written. Environmental presence, we talked about already. And if they have data based on human studies, or they have occupational exposure studies and things like that, they may say, well, we want to move this up more in the regulations because, for example, it's a sensitizer or it's a suspect carcinogen or something like that. We will have the authority to move this up in the priority list of those 20,000 chemicals. So again, most of those considerations are going to be on OECD recommendations. So if OECD has considered something to be a suspect carcinogen, I would say it's a fairly safe bet. We don't know this for certain, but a fairly safe bet that Israel is going to look at moving that up in the assessment process. They're talking about the methodology again. They're going to look at different things. They're going to have an advisory committee. So it's not just the Ministry of Environment saying yes or no on something. They're going to have advisory committees, which was, you see here, will come from other regulators. So from other ministries, some of those ministries we looked at in the beginning, as well as universities, as well as industrial organizations, interest groups, things like that. So it's not going to be specific to just the ministry's decision and ministry's information. So again, be aware, if something is out in the literature, it may be brought in and may be brought in to prioritize your substance sooner rather than later. And you see from there, the chemicals will be tested according to this methodology, and they will come up with a list of what they're considering to be high priority substances. And those will go to the forefront of those roughly 20,000 substances that are going to be looked at first. And just here, if you want to dig down into section 11, you see how, they can add chemicals if they don't meet this high priority, but they feel that they should. The notice and comment period, well, if they say you have a high priority substance and you feel, no, I don't, you have an opportunity to challenge that. And they're going to look at that high priority list every 10 years. So they're going to take presumably some of the data that you give in year 4 and year 8 and look at that when they look at the list en suite every 10 years, as well as, again, what is out in the literature, what's in universities, OECD and others. And then just coming as we're wrapping up, again, we're really starting to group these sections because they're very specific and I don't want to get bogged down in them, but I want you to spend some time on knowing where to go if you want to. talking about how they're going to be assessing in this graded manner over time. So it's not going to be just a list of give me 10 substances and I'm going to work them simultaneously. It's going to be graded. There's going to be number 1, then number 2, and number 3, and so on. The manufacturer we talked about and the importer will have the ability to give input, but also those other chemical dealers. Remember, we talked about in the beginning, they didn't have a registration obligation, but they still handled the substances. Those who are not required to report can still give information, and they can give information either way. They can say the substance should be considered high priority, or they can say, no, the substance should not be considered high priority, high priority, excuse me. So they have the ability to contribute, and not necessarily in a particular way. They could go either to support or to challenge. One of the questions I've been getting asked so far is, you see here in section 13, you do have an abbreviated procedure for chemicals that are already REACH registered or TSCA registered. You still have to go through the evaluation procedure. Don't misunderstand me. You still have to go through the notification process, but the actual evaluation process will be, presumably, according to this, less, because you've already got data in the US, in the EU, possibly Japan, South Korea, places like that. This is interesting because when you're talking about the notification, actually submitting information to the registrar in the beginning, remember we said there's no opportunity for a CEF or a leading party or a consortia or things like that. Here, when you're submitting information as it relates to considering your substance to be high priority, in that particular instance, you can form a consortia, you can form a CEF, to use the REACH term, and have a lead registrar on and have everybody similarly situated come in and provide information, but just for those substances that they consider to be high priority. And also, interestingly, under section 14B, it allows anybody to submit information, positive or negative, provided the language is well-founded and reliable. So it's not going to be just those academic institutions and the OEC and so on. If I feel, and I have scientific reasoning behind it as an individual, that your substance could be a high priority substance, I have the ability to submit basically what we call in the United States notice and comment to give that information. You're not restricted. It is publicly available to many people. Similarly, if I say no, I don't feel it is because I work with your chemistry in a lab setting or industrial setting, I have the ability as an individual to come forward and give that information as well. Just running through the last couple slides, and should be straight on time. You'll get the information at the end of the risk management. The risk management is published for 45 days, notice and comment. Again, you can comment if you choose to do that. Section 20, other countries in Israel that do not require registration can extend the decisions. So if there are from other countries who have said, this requires registration in Europe under REACH or in the US under TSCA, and Israel doesn't require registration for whatever reason, Section 20 allows the authority to say, well, we can extend that decision. We can apply that decision and require it, even though under the terms of the ICRL, it would not be required. But again, as you see there is a notice period that has to be involved. Talking about the last few sections of the regulation, mainly here it identifies the members of that committee. I said in the beginning there would be a committee. It would not just be the Ministry of Environment. These are the agencies that are proposed to be part of that committee to make the evaluations and decisions. And as you see also at the bottom, they're experts in other fields. So public health and environmental protection, not just what's put forward here. Section 32, this is another question I get, is what are they proposing for sanctions or fines or penalties? It's 3-tier at this point. What they're proposing now is, you see the amounts in Israeli shekels, and I did one conversion for US dollars to give you a sense of that. For an individual or corporation, that's the lowest level. Hey, I didn't know I had to do this. I said I couldn't get the information and I stopped. That could be a low-level fine. Violations of duty to report, to provide information, to retain information comes under there, as I just talked about. The intermediate level increases your penalties, and it talks about, specifically in the regulation, risk management provisions. So if you are not mitigating a risk properly and you're found to be in violation, you would likely fall into that intermediate level. The highest level, there are actually no minimums in the ICRL, but they do provide suggested maximums. So you do have a top end on your violation, but there isn't a minimum. So the authority could say, for example, I want it to be 10,000 shekels, or I want it to be 1,000 shekels. They have that ability. They're capped by regulation, but there is no minimum. And also, as you see here, you can have an administrative notice instead of a financial penalty. They send you a letter, say, please fix this, and if you fix it in X time, we won't cite you and give you a notification or a financial violation. And then the two addendums we talked about in the very beginning, the list of substances that are created but are not considered chemicals to which the reporting applies. So they are created in production, but they're not required to be reported. You see the exemptions in there. An example I give is site-limited intermediates under TSCA. You're making something, but you're only using it on the site to do something, to make another chemical, to whatever it might be. That would be an example of something that is made during the production process, but not required to be reported, not a chemical to which reporting applies. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining. Exceptions to definitions for chemicals. We talked about how they're exempt from registrations due to regulation by other legislation, pesticides and so on. But here are other materials in the addendum that are specific as well. So if you have a medical preparation that is maybe not registered as a medical device, let's say, but it's a medical preparation, that would be exempt from your regulation. Food contact chemicals, chemicals used into food, supplements, nutrients, things like that. Pesticides intended for use on the human body, mosquito repellents, for example, that would not be something that's considered a definition of chemical under this regulation. And materials from natural sources as well. And it's going to incorporate by reference materials listed in the fourth appendix of REACH. So if it's on REACH, it will be brought in here as well. Last couple we got, third addendum talks about mechanisms for the registration evaluation in the EU and the US. So again, we said if it's regulated in the EU, approved in the EU, and in the United States, that could bring you in. This is where the third addendum, where it actually talks about it in the third addendum. And the fourth addendum, the minimum information about the chemical that's required to be reported to the purchaser. So fourth addendum is going to tell you what you must give the purchaser, where you can't say, I don't have it, I don't want to share it, it's proprietary. Specific information is laid out there. Any questions that haven't come up before that you want to put in the chat room? I think we have about 3 people left, and I'm willing to stay as long as you want. If you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it. Or if you want later on, just send it to me by email. We can get that information out to you as well. While you're thinking about that or typing, one of the things that we've done is this is now the second one in the series that we've done of complimentary webinars. I said first quarter updates for chemical regulation in Middle East was done in February. Obviously, this done in March. And at the end of April, April 29th, at this same time, we're going to have a discussion, complimentary discussion on GHS regulations in Mexico and South America. Specifically, who has GHS in place, what is required under their GHS regulations, how do they differ from, for example, edition 7 of the Purple Book, and what regulations are coming out, who is expected to have GHS in place in 2021, possibly in 2022. When I send the information out by slides with the recording, you'll have a link in there if you want to sign up for that as well. And again, that is complimentary. All right, so we don't have any other questions. I think we're just a tiny bit over, so I appreciate everybody joining. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.